shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
What was that, Joseph? That was good talking? All right. Let's see how I can do in part B. Of this piece of scripture, this piece from St. Luke, David Lose, he is a seminary professor and he's a published author, he's a theologian. Of this piece of scripture, he says that it is to the church so familiar as to be dangerous. And as he unpacks that, what he wants to say is, whenever something is familiar, we tend to believe that we understand it. And as we think that we understand this, we become complacent with it. Today, Jesus doesn't just tell a sweet little story with a moral ending. Jesus tells a parable. And parables, by their very nature, are intended to poke. To poke, to shock, to surprise, and to cause the listeners to wrestle. So until you get poked, or shocked, or surprised, or you begin to wrestle today, then we haven't really entered in to this parable. It begins with a lawyer approaching Jesus. Now, the cool thing about Jesus is Jesus, no matter who the person is, always sees their heart and knows their intentions. So whether it's a woman washing his feet or a lawyer coming forward to challenge him, Jesus knows the intention of their heart, and the intention of this man was to test. Kind of took me right back to when the kids were little and trying to figure out where the boundaries were and what the boundaries were, and they tested a lot. I have a friend who talks about when her guy was little, and the rule was when you go into the store, do not touch anything. And so he kind of made it a habit to walk into the store and touch something. The Pharisee, the lawyer, my bad, the lawyer today isn't being quite so gentle. The lawyer is pushing and he is testing. So, Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, in a true rabbinical manner, answers the question with a question. What does the law say? The man is a lawyer. He knows what the law says. That I am to love the Lord my God with all of my heart and all of my soul and all of my strength and all of my mind, and I am to love my neighbor as myself. Groovy, Jesus says. I'm sure it's in there someplace. Groovy. Go do that. Excuse me, Jesus. Excuse me. Who's my neighbor? Jesus, how little can I make this box? What's the least amount that I need to do to check that off my list? And so unfolds this pointy, shocky parable. Because in the parable, the good guys, the nice people, do not do the right thing. And the least likely guy, the despicable guy, does do the right thing. Which gives us an incredible moment to have a commercial break. Recently, the book Gods at War was recommended to me. And the entire premise of this book is that all sin comes out of breaking the first commandment. I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods. And yet, we have all sorts of gods. And every time we fail to have the Lord our God as our primary God, we begin to break commandments. So, along comes the Levite, along comes the priest. And they see the guy, and they know the right thing. The right thing is to help the man, and yet they go out and around and continue on their way. What is their God in that moment? Are they worried that the robbers might still be there and they might be next? Is their God in that moment personal safety? You know, they could have been running late. Their agenda might have been their God in that moment. And the reality is, as Jewish men, if they would have helped the man, they would have been ritually unclean, and it would have taken them a week in order to return to their duties as priests and Levite. Doesn't matter the answer. Whatever the answer is, they put that as their highest priority. That was their God in that moment. And along comes a Samaritan. Now, folks, for the Jews hearing this story, there was never any such thing as a good Samaritan. There was no such thing. Jews and Samaritans despised each other. So as Jesus is telling the story, he's talking about the most despicable person you can imagine being the hero. That despicable person sees the man, and he doesn't see a burden. He sees someone who needs his help. And so he goes to him. And folks, he doesn't do the minimum. He dresses the wounds with oil and wine, and he puts bandages on. And then he loads him into the front of his car, and he hauls him into the next town, and he doesn't just drop him at the emergency room. He dresses the wounds, he takes care of him, and then he goes to the innkeeper and says, this should cover him, and you know what, if it doesn't, I'll be back and I'll pay the rest. It's ridiculous hospitality. It's over the top. You know, it's not unlike me to have peanut butter in my back seat or spaghetti with a pop top or Vienna sausages, and when I come to those people with the signs, I hand them peanut butter. I have yet to take any of those people home or put them up in a hotel. The man goes above and beyond what makes any sense to the likes of us. Now we have one more character. We have the guy that's in the ditch. And I think a good question is, who is he? Is he a Jew? Of course, you know, I help my own kind of people, right? Is he a rich man? Is he a thief who had it out with the other thieves and he's the one that got the tar beat out of him? By the way, what was he doing out there traveling by himself on this dangerous road? Maybe he deserved what he got. How often when we see that person who's in need, do we justify what we do or what we don't do, whether they deserve our help or not? And Jesus doesn't even go to that place. Jesus doesn't even go there. He's our neighbor, not because he deserves it, and not because he's earned it, but because he needs it. The good guys don't do what you expect them to do. The least likely character does the right thing. Jesus says, who was the neighbor? And the lawyer says, well, the guy who acted. And there's the centerpiece of it. Being a good neighbor isn't having the right words or the right answers or the right theology. Being a good neighbor is about action. He saw the man, he went to the man, he helped the man, he showed him mercy, he showed him pity. Thus is the good neighbor. Now, as we unpack this story set in the 1st century, sometimes it's a little hard to wrap our brains about just what did it mean and how far did he go. So this week I found 2 stories set in our own context that maybe we can enter into the story just a little bit differently. They're both set in New York City. The first one is a young seminarian. He was a country boy, and he'd moved to New York City in order to go to seminary. And quite frankly, as a country boy, there was really nothing in New York City that agreed with him. In fact, pretty much New York City just kept him really frightened and scared, and it was really a hard place for him. But there was no place harder in New York City than riding the subway. And he quickly figured out to keep his head down, no eye contact, do nothing that threatened anybody else, but he took it a step further. He took to mumbling to himself. You know, there's this incredible thing that happens if you're mumbling to yourself. You end up with this huge bubble around you because people are pretty sure you're dangerous. So that was his mode. Each day, as he came and he went on the subway, eyes down, do not challenge anybody, and mumbling to himself, blah, 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 blah. And so he got onto the subway that morning, and the doors closed, and he settled in, and once he was pretty sure, he kind of looked around. In kitty corner across from him was a drunk. At least the man looked like a drunk, he smelled like a drunk, and he was acting like a drunk. And not only that, he was acting like he was a drunk on a bender. And as they came into a station, he kind of came to and looked around, and then as doors would close and they would go on their way, he would nod off again. And so they continued their journey. A few stops later, the doors come open and 3 young men got on the subway with them. And 2 of the young men planted themselves next to the drunk. The 3rd young man was standing. And off they went. Doors close, train takes off, and again the drunk's head begins to bob. And this time he actually falls over onto one of those young men. And with a violent burst of energy, the young man throws the drunk against the wall, and in the next instant, the young man who's standing karate kicks him, and his steel-toed boots come in perfect contact with the man's head, and teeth and blood and spit go splattering across the car. And the young men are high-fiving each other because they really took out that drunk. And a couple stops later, the doors come open and the young men get off, and the drunk is still lying on the floor. When it got quiet in that subway car, the drunk finally pulled himself to his knees. And at that moment, he was finally able to look up, and that's when he and the seminarian actually made eye contact. And while the drunk never said a word, the message that he conveyed was, "It doesn't matter. I'm just a drunk after all." Seminarian is no longer a seminarian. He's now an old pastor. It's astonishing how often those scenes continue to replay in his mind, especially in the dead of night. And while he remembers the sights and the sounds of all that happened that day, what he remembers most is his own inactivity before, during, or after the assault. And even as he remembers his own inactivity, he also remembers thinking, well, the drunk probably wouldn't have accepted my help anyway. And if I would have done something, those 3 probably would have turned on me. And why would you help a drunk anyway? He's been poisoning himself for all these years. Now, if you were his parents or his grandparents, his siblings or his spouse, what would you say to him? What would you say about that day that he rode the subway? Second story is also set in New York City. It's also set at the subway. This story is about a man by the name of Wesley Autry. Construction worker, regularly rode the subway, arrived one day with his 2 little girls. And as they were waiting for their car to pull in, another rider of the subway apparently had a seizure, and in the midst of that seizure fell into the well where the train was due to come in. Without really giving it a whole bunch of thought, Wesley jumped onto the tracks. His first inclination was to drag the man to safety, but as soon as he jumped in, it was clear that the next train was coming into the station. So instead of pulling the man to safety, he got the man between the tracks, and he threw his own body over the man's seizing body. And in came the train. And the clearance was so close that it left soot marks on the back of his stocking cap. Headlines, at least some of them would read, "Good Samaritan saves man on track 1." Now, if that was your son, or your grandson, or your spouse, what would you have to say to him? Would you encourage that similar behavior over and over again? Here is the point of this Good Samaritan story. What the man does is over and beyond our inclination in terms of self-preservation, in terms of how far will we go and what makes sense to do. It's crazy over the top. And if we really wrestle with what he did, we are really left realizing there is only one person who would go that far. Jesus is the one willing to leave the heavenly place. Jesus is the one willing to come and find us wherever we are, whatever condition we're in, and bind up our wounds and stop our bleeding. And because we have a God who's come to us like that, found us, healed us, brought us back from death to life, because of that, we are new creations. We are new creations who have been loved, and grace and mercy has been poured out on us. And folks, we're not going to get it perfect. But as new creations, as children of the redeemed one, we are indeed called and we are sent. Go, Jesus says, and do likewise.
Well, this light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Every day, every day, every day, every day, every day, I let my little light shine. Oh, Jesus gave me light, I'm gonna let it shine.